webinars. My name is, welcome to this edition of the Sankofa African webinar. My name is Benjamin Akwe. Today is February 21st, 2025. It is 11 a.m., approximately 11 a.m. US Eastern Time, and it's 10 a.m. the Central Time in Tennessee. It is 4 p.m. GMT in Abidjan, and it's 7 p.m. all the way in Nairobi, and it's 6 p.m. in South Sudan. This conversation we are going to have today is part of our discussions on the contemporary issues happening on the African continent. The reason why Sankofa African Affairs has taken the responsibility is so as to bridge the gap between what experts in the diaspora view the issues on the African continent, and those experts on the African continent also view it. We just want to bridge the gap because the diaspora has been considered or has been earmarked as the fifth region. So the point is that if the diaspora has been earmarked as the fifth region, how do we bridge the gap between those in the diaspora and those on the African continent? So that is the purpose of the program. The purpose of the program is to inform and educate Africans in the diaspora and those on the continent about contemporary issues that is facing the continent, and also about great power strategies and objectives towards the continent in terms of the Chinese, the Americans, the Russians, the European Union, their objectives and their strategies that they have towards the African continent. So we've been doing this for the past 18 months, right? Last week, we did something on the DR Congo, the conflict on the African continent. And we just had the elections of the African Union, the African Union Summit just last week. We decided to take on the elections of the African Union Commission chairperson. So this is what is going to be the focus of our conversation today. We want to focus on the African Union chairperson, the role that he plays, and we've had several African Union chairperson over the years. The contribution that they have made, is it about they coming in with their own agenda, or is it about continuity? So these are some of the discussions that we want to have today, right? And fortunately for us today, to help us delve into the conversations, we have Dr. Benjamin Masha, who is not joined us yet now, but we have Dr. Esen Emil Ako, who's a developing peace and security expert who is joining us from Abidjan, Ivory Coast. Did I get your name right?
Yes, you did. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Akwe. Yeah, actually, I'm not yet a doctor. I'm just figuring out how I can complete my PhD, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, sure. Then we have Dr. Wanjala Nsango, Professor of International Studies, Rod College, Memphis, Tennessee. Did I get your name right?
Yes, you did.
Okay, now I want certain clarification, right? Which country exactly are you from?
I am from Kenya.
Oh, okay, you are from Kenya. Okay, so
yes.
That means we are going to have two Kenyans actually on the program.
Okay.
All right. So okay, so we have two other panelists already joining us. So once we are waiting for the other panelists to join us, let's get into. So I want you to situate your opening remarks within the just ended AU summit, right? What they just did last week. Just try to give us a background in terms of a brief summary of whatever took place last week before we get into our conversation. So let's start with you, Esen. If you have been following what happened in Addis Ababa, we want a brief opening remarks from you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Benjamin Akwe, and good morning, good afternoon to fellow colleagues who are connected to this call, and to all the people watching. I think it's really an honor to participate in these forms of conversations, because it gives us the opportunity to share our thought on current issues, and that's really great. And these are things that need to be continued. So regarding the elections of the chairperson of the African Union Commission that recently ended, as we saw it, it has been, I would say it has been an habit of electing new people since the creation of the African Union that derived from the organization of African Union, African states, OAU. So this was not a big event because we have been seeing these secessions. But what is the event is, I think, what is going to happen after this election, because we saw previous leaders of the African Union commissions across the continent with several issues. But at the same time, we ask ourselves, what have been the impact? What have they been able to achieve? I think we'll go into some of these issues later, but I think this is the real issue. We saw the elections. There were several rounds of elections. Then Mr. Mahmoud Ali Yusuf from Djibouti got elected. We congratulate him. We know he's a man of experience, but what's the next step? I think that's where we would like to delve into more. So I will stand here and give back the floor and then come back later.
You are muted, Benjamin.
Okay. Yeah, I want to find out what will be your opening remarks in terms of what was done last week. You had the African Union Summit, which led to the elections of the new African Union Commission chairman. What is your overall assessment of it before we get into the conversation?
Is that the question for me?
No, it's a opening remark. What is your opening remarks in
Okay.
terms of
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Kwei. Here are my opening remarks, so preliminary comments on what happened at the African Union in the process of electing the African Union Commission chair. One, for me, what stood out for me was the power of diplomacy in terms of the process of canvassing for the votes to win the position of chair of the African Union Commission. My observation was that the main contenders were Mr. Yusuf from Djibouti and Raila Odinga from Kenya. And the manner in which they conducted their diplomatic process in terms of canvassing for votes was very different. One was much more subtle and became much more successful. The other one was very aggressive, but it ended up not achieving the results, which is quite illustrative of how effective one is to go about these things. Number two, or my second observation, is about the regional dynamics. Do you see what we call Francophone Africa, what we call Anglophone Africa, what we may call Arab Africa, and so on? That those dynamics really were at play in the process of electing the African Union chair. If you remember, the first rounds of votes, Raila was ahead. Then over time, he was overtaken by the candidate from Djibouti. And it has a lot to do with the regional dynamics. And number three and the third is, for me, what stood out was how Kenya then is perceived, particularly the Kenyan leadership is perceived by the different regions of the continent. And for me, it calls for some kind of self-retrospection on the part of the Kenyan leadership about their own image and how they are perceived by the regional blocs on the continent. And so those are my three main observations that I formed from what happened at the African Union last week.
Right. Thank you very much. I just want to give you a caveat, right? I was Richard, right, the guy from Madagascar, right? I had a conversation with him, so I knew exactly what he was doing. He was giving me first-hand information about what was really happening, right? We were supposed to interview him at some point in time. There was a scheduled conflict. I did reach out to Raila Odinga, personal assistant, for us to have a conversation with Raila Odinga's assistant. We didn't get a feedback. I did call Yusuf personally to get him to and for us to engage him. I didn't get a feedback, so I'm just trying to put this thing on notice that I got involved in some of the things that really happened. All right, so now let's go to our discussions. Right, we cannot talk about the elections, the African Union Commission elections, without trying to look at what has transpired in the past. So we want to look at the OAU. We knew what the OAU stand for, the break between the two blocks. the Moravia and the Casablanca bloc, who were talking about continental Africa. They were talking about Pan-Africanism, right? And the other group were talking about what independent sovereign states, right? And where we are now, I want to find out from you that, because you hear some of our leaders say they are Pan-Africanist, Pan-Africanist, right? We don't know what they mean by Pan-Africanist. Now, if you look at the current the AU, the way it's structured along the lines of the European Union, right? Right. The model that they are using is what they call the spillover effect. That let's look at economic integration. After we get into economic integration, then there's going to be the spillover effect into the political. So this is what has been happening. The point is, is the current AU, right, being, I don't know how to do it. Are they having some sort of shadowing based on the OAU, right? Because even though we are talking about non-intervention, but the AU has moved away from non-intervention to what they call indifference. That means when there's a conflict in a particular country, they will take some actions. But that action will not mean that they are going to end the conflict. They'll go in as peacemakers. And that has not been able to resolve the conflict on the continent. Just like what the African Union was doing back then in terms of non-interventions in the domestic affairs of other countries, right? So what is really going on is the OAU casting a shadow on the current African Union. Let's start with you first, Prof.
We'll start with me.
Yeah, I want to get your take on that. Do you think that the OAU is casting its shadow on the current African Union, even though they are trying to do something in terms of, okay, when there's a conflict, we want to find ways and means to resolve it, but they don't get it resolved. Let's look at what is happening in Somalia, right? There's an attempt. One of our guests over here is serving in Somalia. It belongs to the AU song, right? Let's see what is happening in, what do you call it, in the Sudan, right? The African Union is there. Let's see what is happening in the Kia in DR Congo, right? They are trying to solve, but they don't actually resolve the problem. They seem to be doing something. That is what they call what we are not going to sit by and not do anything. That's the indifference. But when they go in, they don't actually resolve anything concrete, which is more or less similar to what the OAU was doing, which is, okay, we are not going to intervene. So for the OAU, we are not going to intervene. But with the AU now, we are going to do something about it. But that's something that we are doing about it doesn't actually resolve the problem.
Exactly, and that is, I think, the weakness of the African Union in terms of its capacity to actually do something to resolve conflicts on the continent. That weakness has been carried over from the OAU. So the African Union says, we will not stand by, we will come in, but the manner in which they come in does not end up being very effective in terms of resolving the conflicts that it gets involved in. And this weakness is also illustrated by the fact of having to rely on resources from even outside the continent. It demonstrates the kind of weaknesses that the African Union has. So are really the African states committed to building an African Union that can be effective in terms of intervening in conflicts around the continent, in terms of implementing projects that will actually lead to some kind of Pan-African unity? In my view, there isn't a very strong political commitment to create an African Union that will actually be effective. If it were, for example, the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa should never have been constructed by resources from outside the continent. It is China that funded the building of the African Union headquarters. It is China that funded the technology that is used at the African Union headquarters. So much so that there are commentators who argue that the systems are bugged. Whatever goes on within the headquarters of the African Union can be, listened to from China. And so that very nature, that you are an independent continent full of independent countries, you are constructing a headquarters for purposes of your organization, and you are having to be funded by someone else. Someone else is in charge of the construction. It doesn't spell well for the commitment on the part of African leaders to build an institution that will be very effective. And that actually is what defines the weakness of the African Union in terms even of the little matter of mediating conflicts on the continent. If the political leaders are really committed to doing that, it can be done. Look at how the North-South conflict in Sudan was resolved by IGAD. IGAD were effective mainly because they took the greatest initiative and identified the real problems that the conflict was made up of, and they were able to resolve it and reach a comprehensive agreement. But that is not the case of the African Union, and it has a lot to do with the political will on the part of African leaders to build actually an effective institution.
Sure, I'll come back to you. I'll come back to you later. Let me go to SN, right? What is your thought on what Prof just said? What's your thoughts on
Thank you, Dr. Akwe. Well, I think I will offer my comment along three main concepts, which are visions, commitment, and independence. I believe from the creation of OAU, the vision was really good. The vision of having an integrated Africa, an Africa of newly independent countries coming together to define a vision and work toward the achievement of this vision was really great. And so from the beginning, these countries were facing a lot of issues. I mean, the decolonization. Some of the African countries were not yet fully independent, or even if they were independent, they were still under strong power control from the colonial powers or other I would say, external forces in external countries. So in this regard, the founding fathers of the African Unions, and from the 60s all the way to early 2000, where it became the AU, they tried their best. They tried their best to create this community of purpose that will try to define a common vision for the continent. But from an institution that has has a vision of creating integration, more development, I think from the OAU to the AU, we haven't seen a lot of real changes. Of course, there have been a lot of remarks, a lot of slogans, a lot of, I would say, statements. But actually, what has transpired, what has come out of these wills, if we can call it these strong political wills, what has transpired, what has been the effects? Like, let me take a few examples from the creation of the OAU. African countries were facing issues like, lack of human resources, because countries were just newly independent and they needed to build educational institutions. There were a lot of conflict, intra-country conflict, like internal independence, conflict for independence within some countries, within some blocks. There were also a lot of political coup. All of these are issues that the continent were facing, in addition to the lack of infrastructure. Like before, it was really difficult to travel from one African country to the other. One had to travel to Europe, to Turkey, to Dubai, or wherever else to come back to the African continent. So on this front, they try to promote integration. They try to promote free movement of people and all of these. But in order to fully, I think, mark this vision, this commitment, I think there are things that the African Union should have done before. Like, for example, the African Union passport for free movement of people. Like today, it's easier for me from Cote d'Ivoire to travel to France than to travel to Angola, to travel to the DRC, where I worked for 2 years. It was a whole, I would say, nightmare to get a visa from Cote d'Ivoire to go to the DRC, and to get a flight from Cote d'Ivoire to go to the DRC to other countries. It's so difficult. Why can't we work, in order to effectively implement this vision of ours that will, that does not, I would say, Of course, it might cost something, but that in the long run will be, I think, profitable and beneficial for all countries. The integrations, we have sung it, we have said it, but what is the effectiveness of integration? Even when you take my region, you know, the ECOWAS regions, we talk about free movement of people and goods, but when you want to travel from Cote d'Ivoire to Togo, you know, by land, you will face a lot of racketeering from security forces, from the customs officials of all along all the borders, and this has become like I would say a common thing, because when you are planning your trip, you need to plan for the bribes and the all these you know, unnecessary funds that people will collect along the way. So I think on this issue, we're having a vision. The vision is good, but have we seen the commitment? I think the commitment has lacked. Of course, we have seen some strong leadership of some African leaders. I mean, some head of state who were elected and actually work and contributed to advance some issues, one or the other. We saw a president like President Thabo Mbeki. We saw other head of states that really were instrumental in pushing some of the agendas. But have we seen a continuity in all of these, I would say, commitment from one African Union Commission head, from one head of state to the next, to you know, the following, and this is something that has lacked. Regarding independence, I think Dr. Wanjala said it. An entity, a global, I would say, continental entity that is funded, receive about 60% of its fund from external sources. What can they really achieve? What can they expect? What can they, I would say, how can they plan for projects, for activities, and for their vision? Because whatever comes as foreign aid, whatever you call it, is earmarked, and it comes with restrictions, it comes with direction from the donning institutions or from the countries that give these funds, and you cannot bank on this for your development. Like currently, we are experiencing a crisis in the foreign aid sector just because the head of the president of United States decided to halt the foreign fund. How is this going to hurt Africa? I think we need, in addition to our vision, which is good, a good commitment, and this commitment has to have has a basis, the independence of our country, of our I would say our continent, of our countries, toward more integration, because there are a lot that we can do together to end on this issue. I was analyzing the data from you know, the top world gold producers. You know, if you take the
You are
like the
muted,
top 20 or
Dr.
30,
Akwe.
you will see that there are so many African countries in.
Okay, Esa, let me
Can you hear me?
No, let me interrupt you briefly. Let me interrupt you briefly and go to Prof. I'll come back to you. So,
Sure.
Prof, you could see that Esa has enumerated some of the problems, right, in terms of integration, how a common currency, in terms of integration through migration, in terms of language. He has enumerated all these problems. And I'm saying that the problem that he has enumerated is as a result of we trying to follow the European Union integration model, right? Where they took time to integrate in terms of currency, in terms of parliament, what they call the spillover effect. But all the problems we are enumerating can be resolved through a continental government, right? So since we know the problems and we know that there's a lot of interference on the continent from a powerful state, and we ourselves, we are having internal member state countries, why are we not finding the only solution which is out there, which was proposed as far back in 1963, which is continental government? Why are we not going for that? And we are still relying on the independent member states with sovereignty, which is not resolving our problem. Why are we still holding on to something that is not helping us?
I think it has a lot to do with the self-interest of African political leaders. And this was even defined way back in the 60s during the contestations between the Casablanca group, the Monrovia group, about one group, especially led by Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, saying, we have to unite and form a continental government. And that is the best way to go. Then you had those others who are saying, no, 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 no. Let us achieve our own independence individually and then begin with the economic integration as the building blocks for eventual continental unity. And so you have this sense on the part of those who achieve leadership in our different countries on the continent who would rather remain big fish in their small ponds than become small fish in one great continental pond. So that is the main problem. Number two, we also have a problem of much of our leadership that seem not to understand the dynamics of imperialism and the interests of foreign powers. There are political leaders who do not seem to understand that. So you can imagine the president of Kenya is the current chair, I think, of the East African community, which has expanded beyond the original 3 member states of Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, to include South Sudan, to include Rwanda, Burundi, the DRC, and so on. Now, a major issue comes up in the DRC. He is called upon as chair of the East African community to do something, to lead an effort to resolve the conflict. Who is the first person the guy calls? He calls the president of France. Why will you be going to make reference to a foreign leader in respect to a conflict in your own continent within a community, a region that you are actually supposed to be chair of? So there is that misunderstanding. If we had political leaders in the mold of what my friend has referred to, the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, was a true Pan-Africanist. If you had a leader like Kwame Nkrumah in his original form, true Pan-Africanist. If you had a political leader like the former president of Burkina Faso, who was assassinated, Thomas Sankara, a true Pan-Africanist who really gave powerful speeches at the then Organization of African Unity. The current president of Burkina Faso seems to understand the imperial machinations of external forces. But we have many of our political leaders who do not understand, and they continue to kowtow to foreign interests to the disadvantage of the continent, to the disadvantage of the citizens of African countries. And that is the main problem in my view, that I would rather remain the boss in my country than do what? Support this move to create one continental government in which I will be lesser. Do you see? So I think that has something to do with it.
Let me go to Esan, right? From what Prof has just enumerated, right? If you look at the Congo conflict, right? The first country that is blamed is the Belgians, right? Then we go to the French. So these are imperial powers that we are seeing the hands of imperial powers in our country. Rwanda just passed released a press statement that they are was severely at ties with Belgium. So we on the continent know very well the imperial hands and the impact it have on the African continent. So Ethan, my question is isn't it time that the African leaders should understand that the only way to get the hands of the imperial leaders is to move towards continental government? I want your final reaction on that. Then we'll go to the AU chairmanship. What do you think that is where we are now, given what is happening? In terms of the DR Congo, DR Congo is more or less the lifeblood of Africa. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, on the issue of a continental government, a little bit, I have some reservations, actually, some issues with it. Because when you look at the current, form of leadership that we have seen, of course, there have been a few outstanding examples of leaders who are really selfless, who have tried to, achieve some forms of economic or social development for the countries. And so the countries are doing more or less okay. But when you take it in general, what type of leadership will be at the top of a continental government? I fear that if there is any such entity, it will be like a huge behemoth that will create more problem than solving some. I believe that the structuring of the African Union currently is not bad, but what we need is more integrations, is more joint actions, more joint visions, and more actions, common actions, like the Continental Free Trades, initiative. If this is really effectively implemented, I think will not African countries will
No,
not need the
no,
AGOA
okay,
of the United States.
No, we agree. We agree that these things are part of integration. But the biggest problem that we have is imperialism, the intervention of the foreign powers. That is the biggest
Sure,
boom for Africa.
sure. I will come to the issue of imperialism. But what's the other side of the coin I was just describing is that because we are not united, it is easy. It is really easy for these foreign powers to distract our leaders and have them with them. Like the example you gave to solve an issue on the continent, they go to take their advice from France, from United Kingdom, or from I don't know. And this is one of the biggest issues. Of course, in an integrated world and with our colonial legacy with these countries, we cannot part, totally with them. But if we affirm more leadership, more integration, more joint actions, be it on the political, economic, social, education side in Africa, and Africa has one voice toward international issues, like if there is a vote at the Security Council or at the UN, Africa goes with one voice in one accord led by the African Union. I think these countries will think twice before trying to impose things on us. But because we are so much divided, because we have short visions, because we don't want to commit before others within the continent, because there is this rivalry that has been rampant from the creation of the African OAU to the AU up to now, because we don't want to commit more than others. It is easy for these foreign powers to take advantage of us, of our resources, and of our, I would say, positions and votes in international, at the UN and everywhere. So more need to be done at our side before even accusing France or Belgium or whatsoever. I'll stop
All
here.
right, thank you very much. Now let's go to the narrative, which has to do with the politics of Francophoneness and Arabism in the elections of America, AU Commission Chairperson, right? Prof, you stated earlier on that most of the funding comes from external sources. The biggest funding of the African Union comes from the UN and the EU, then followed by the US, then China. So they are there. Then apart from that, there are wealthy African member states who also do a lot of contributions, right? And we have, I have Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Nigeria, and South Africa. These are wealthy African countries who also do a lot of what? Voluntary contributions towards the African Union. Now, if you observe very carefully, I'm going to give you the list of people who have been elected as African Union Commission chairperson, and you have an idea of the role played by these countries, right? Either overtly or what? Inovertly, right? I'm talking about Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Nigeria, and South Africa. Now, so 2002 to 2003, when we were doing the transition from OAU to the African Union, Amara Essie, right, became the chairperson He from Cote d'Ivoire, French-speaking country. Okay. 2003 to 2008, Alpha Omar Konare from Mali, French-speaking country. 2008 to 2012, Jinping from Gabon, French-speaking country. 2012 to 2017, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. She could be an exception because South Africa is also a major contributor. So that is why she was able to get her way out. If you go back to 2017 to 2025, Musa Faki Mohammed, who just left from Chad, right? Now we have 2025 to 2030. We have Mahmoud Ali Yusuf Djibouti. So you can see the effect of the Francophone countries. Because if you look at those North African countries, right, most of them speak French. So you could see their impact, even though we are talking about regional balance, right? You could see the impact of the French wealthy countries and their impact on who becomes the African Union chairperson. Would you agree to that? We'll come to the Arab aspect of it later on. But the Arab aspect means what? If those French-speaking countries, the Algeria, the Egypt, and the Libya, right, have most Islamic countries or Arab countries, they definitely will be getting some sort of financing for the Middle East in terms of money, and that money will be used to influence who becomes the African Union Commission. So let's deal with the French aspect first, then we'll go to the Arabic aspect of it. What's your take on the way the AU Commission chairperson is elected?
Very interesting observation, Doctor.
Yeah, because the only the only exception was the South African. The South African is also a contributor, so that is why she was able to win. So go ahead.
Yeah, I had not actually really gone into looking at the French connection of all these people who have served as as commission chairs. It is coming as a revelation for me. But it does point to the fact of how united with one purpose, how united Francophone countries are. And I remember a former political leader from Kenya mentioning this long before the elections last week of the African Union Commission chair. This former political leader of ours was saying, there is no way you can break up the Francophone community in terms of their vote for the African Union. You cannot. That they really have a unity of purpose and they go for their interests as a united front. And that may explain it. But also, I would add, in the case of the last elections, for example, it will have been possible for somebody else to have been elected if the process will have done in a particular way, particularly with regard to the candidate from Kenya. Now, here is a situation, and this again comes back to this idea of foreign intervention, foreign interests, our perception of what is good for us and what is good for others. Now, if you remember 2 years, was it immediately after our president took power, he made a visit to the US. Do you see? And there he accepted to send Kenyan police forces to Haiti to handle a problem that was not created by anyone else, but by these imperial powers, the US and the French. Do you see? Then he accepted to play lucky to these foreign powers. Number two, the war in the Middle East between Hamas and Israel. Yeah. South Africa is taking Israel to court for violations of human rights over the war that it was waging against the Palestinians. Our president in Kenya is actually issuing a statement of solidarity with the president of Israel, Netanyahu. So how are the other political leaders on the continent going to view you? When he's called upon to intervene, to take action in the Congo, instead of calling the political leaderships around that region, the first person he's calling is the president of France. Do you see? So already that really disqualifies your candidate in terms of the perceived political stand on your own in terms of your diplomacy, diplomatic dealings, and support for these imperial forces. So that is highly problematic. You see. So it would have been possible for the Kenyan country to have been elected, but because of the stand of the country in terms of its diplomatic positioning, that is highly problematic. And that is why I keep returning to this idea that we have political leaders who have no or little understanding of imperialistic interests around the world, and what they don't seem to understand what they do and the implications of what they are doing, you see. And so for this, I would really one would want to really commend the Francophone countries for being able to dominate this thing for all this time. Where are these others? Where are these others when all this is being taken over by the French? Do you see?
Yeah, so let me go to Esan. Since he's in a francophone country, maybe he has not made that observation. So let's come to you, Esan. You can say, with the exception of South Africa, like I stated, South Africa is a major contributor. So if they put up a candidate, there's a likelihood that they will be able to lobby to win. But apart from South Africa, all the remaining commissioners of the AU, right, all have been from French-speaking countries, right? What do you say to that?
Thank you. I think this observation, I did not make it before. So as you shared the notes and you made the comments, I started seeing it. But first of all, I don't really think that there might be a super unity of French-speaking countries in Africa or in West Africa, or wherever else, that have led them to have these winning positions. Maybe, you know, as you know, some of these leaders, I would say presidents of countries or some of these countries have been very powerful before, and have maybe been able to leverage this power within the regions to have some form of unity to get their members elected. Because when you take
no, but
a block,
the data is there, right? It's not that we are speculating. I've given you the countries, the wealthiest African state that contribute to the African Union: Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Nigeria, and South Africa. Algeria speaks French. Egypt speaks some sort of French. Libya speaks some sort of French, right? These countries,
yeah.
so they have some sort of influence, right? So what I'm saying, that the data shows that all 6 of them, in the case of Zuma alone in South Africa, it has always been the French. So how is it that the French are able to dominate the African Union Commission chairperson, that anybody from any other region is not able? We'll come to the recent elections. But how is it that it's always the French, except in the case of South Africa?
Well, so this is what I'm trying to to explain, because this French issue, yeah, as I said it, I don't see a very strong unity between French-speaking countries. Because if you take the ECOWAS bloc, for example, a country like Nigeria is very powerful. A country like Ghana is also very powerful. If they put forward a candidate, and I think, and they do some lobbying, some diplomatic outreach, I'm sure that a candidate of Nigeria or of Ghana can get elected and will have a support of other countries in the ECOWAS bloc. This I'm sure about it. But maybe to complete this analysis, who were the I think the contenders, the people that these people competed with, to see, you know, to give us a broader picture of the power dynamics, who contended against them, so that, you know, we can offer a, I would say, a balanced analysis.
Okay, so
Of course, we can see that there are more. Let me finish, please.
Okay.
We can see that there are more French speaking, but when you analyze carefully, it's also, we have had some form of regional balances, and I think the regional balance is also good, is good, and maybe other countries need to put forward a more candidate, because for this election we had the former Kenyan Prime Minister, whom I respect very well, but, you know, given the role he recently played in the political history of his country, I'm not sure that he was the one that many of the countries wanted to elect. So this gave Mr. Yusuf of Djibouti, I think, a free way to get elected. Were there other candidates from other countries that were very strong with a strong posture that could have competed against Mahmoud? I'm sure they would have.
Okay, so let's use the recent election. Prof, hold on, let's use the recent elections, right? There were 3 candidates, right? Yusuf is from Djibouti. Djibouti is a small country, right? The only good thing going about Djibouti is military bases, right? The French have their military bases over there. The Japanese have their military base. The US has a military base over there. The Chinese have their military base over there. So they rely so on military base. So it is more or less an imperialistic state where all the military bases are. Okay, let's put him aside. Let's go to the next person, Raila Odinga. Raila Odinga has over 40 years of experience in politics, in African Union politics, right? The other person has to do with Richard. Richard is from Madagascar. He speaks a little bit of French, right? But French is not their official language. These are 3 good candidates, right? And I'm telling you, historically, the French have always won the elections, except in the case of South Africa. So what is so special about the French that they are able, despite them being a minority, if you look at the whole West Africa, the French are a minority, right? If you look at Southern Africa, majority of the countries in Southern Africa don't speak French. If you come to Eastern Africa, most of the countries in Eastern Africa don't speak French, right? If you come to West Africa, you can say that, okay, a lot of them speak French, but majority of the countries on the African continent do not speak French. So how come that the French are able to dominate such an institution chairmanship?
I will only, to add on to what my co-panelist has mentioned, I will speculate only on one more factor. And that factor is the reality that virtually every French speaker on the continent also speaks English. Every English speaker on the continent does not necessarily speak French. And so when you are campaigning for a continental position, the ability to speak an extra language, I think, is an added advantage, because the people who speak that language begin to see you as one of their own. So somebody like Yusuf, I think he speaks English, he speaks
Arabic,
French.
and Arabic.
I am told he also speaks some Arabic.
Correct. We'll come to the Arabic aspect. We'll come to the Arabic connection.
Yes. So the point then is that he can go, if he goes to the delegation from any Francophone country, he engages them in their language. When he goes to the French speakers, he engages them with on the basis of their own language. He can speak Arabic as well. Do you see? So that positions him very well to be head of the African Union Commission. So that is a huge advantage. The ability of these Francophone political leaders to be able to also speak English. And so when they arrive in Kenya, they arrive wherever, they can engage in English and they can be seen as one of our own, you see. So that's an advantage. The other thing with regard to this past election is that the Kenyan candidate, in my view, his age was a problem. Do you see? At 80 years old, he celebrated his 80th birthday in January. And this is a position for a CEO. It is it requires a lot of rigor. Meetings and travel, and you are at 80. I think at 80 you need to be retired and at home enjoying your retirement benefits and so on. And so age was also a factor, I think, in terms of our president. Number 3, our candidate from Kenya. Number 3, as my co-panelist has mentioned, his role in the recent political developments in the country did not position him to be seen as someone who can be trusted with regard to running a continental organization. There was a major uprising against the incumbent president in Kenya by young generation. He scuttled that by aligning himself with the government that was being seen as oppressive, as repressive, and so on, in order to save that government. And that did not look very well. So much so that, in fact, many Kenyans were against his candidacy for the chairmanship of the African Union. Many Kenyans voiced their support for the Djibouti candidate. And so that was also problematic. So one will have to look at the dynamics surrounding the other elections to fully grasp why the Francophone candidates have come out more successful than anyone else.
All right, let me come to you, Asen, right? I'm bringing another connection, right? The Arab connection, right? So if you look for the past 5, or let's say decade, you can see the growing influence of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and Iran on the African continent. Most of the conflict that you can see happening on the African continent, you can see the footsteps. It used to be the great powers, right? But now we've come to middle powers. The middle powers, you will see countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey, Iran also playing active role on the African continent. Can we say that this part of the Arab connection also plays a part in who becomes the African Union Commission chairperson? Because if you look at, for example, most of the countries that we talk about are what? Francophone countries. They tend to have a huge population of Muslim population, right? Most of the French-speaking countries, right, tend to have that Arabic connection, right? So if you see the growing influence of some of these countries, and even if you look at the election of Yusuf speak Arabic, right? So are we now seeing not only the Francophone connection, but we are also seeing an Arab connection to how the African Union Commission chairperson is elected? Isan.
Diversity of languages based on our, individual histories, but also collective history. So when you take, for example, a country like out of the 6 year, maybe Mali and Chad have this strong Arabic influence, and Djibouti, given its strategic positioning, has at the border between Africa and the Middle East and the countries you have cited. And of course, all these world powers have some interest in influencing who will be the interlocutor on the African continent. And I think the AU chairman is a great interlocutor for the world, with the world on the African continent, and they will really be happy to influence this decision so that they have some favors. This, I would say, this is natural, and it be a game that is played everywhere, even within our countries. But out of all of these, I think the fundamental question is, where is the part of Africa? I mean, where is the interest of Africa in all these elections and leadership that we have seen at the head of the African Union Commission? I think that should be the real issue, because of course there is a French influence, there is an Arabic influence, there might be some Anglophone influence, or maybe the Anglophones are not so much interested in chairing the African Union. But out of all these leaders and this leadership, and especially I think we'll talk more about the current president who has been elected, where is the interest of Africa? And do we put this interest first before the interest of whoever might have sponsored or influenced the elections of these leaders? I think this is the one fundamental issue that we also need to look into. Over to you.
Yeah, okay. Let me come to you from what Isan just said, right? Okay, he's asking the question, where is Africa's interest, right? Let's look at the African Union. The African Union is a heads of state and government, right? It is heads of state government representation, and not a representation of citizens of Africa. So the heads of state are only working in their interest. They are not working in the interest of the members
of serving their own self-interest, rather than committing to this Pan-African cause as a cause in and of itself. And so that creates a problem, you see. And also, this idea that you have brought up about the fact that then the people, the citizens of Africa, are not directly involved in the affairs of the African Union, then so they are detached from what goes on there, you see. How should the African Union, how should ECOWAS, how should the East African Community, how should SADC create mechanisms in which the people can directly be involved and have a stake in the affairs of all these organizations in order to see their benefits, in order to see why they should support them? That is a challenge. But the question then is, are those leaders who are involved in these affairs ready and willing to facilitate citizen participation? They are not, mainly because they are in the service of their own interests rather than the interests of their countries generally, or the interest of their countries specifically, or the interest of their people generally. If I look at the manner, for example, in which the Kenyan president for the commission chair was presented, it had a lot of national political undertones. We are not doing this because we are interested in this person becoming chair of the African Union in order to serve the continent. We, as the political leadership of the country, are doing this because we want to secure our re-election come the next election cycle. Do you see? That is the undertone of why we are supporting this and spending millions and millions of Kenyan shillings to fund the campaign. And the good thing is that many citizens now realize, have come to understand the dynamics of politics and the interest of the political elite. And that's why I have mentioned that, in fact, in Kenya, you had a huge section of the Kenyan populace that was against the candidacy of Raila Odinga because of the underlying political logic of the support and presentation of this particular candidate as the House chair. And so that is the bane of this thing in terms of the self-interest of the political leaders. And it is also what defines or what accounts for how they behave at the international level. Do you see? So when one president is of that at the continental level, that is where the issues are, that is where the problems lie with regard to this idea of continental unity and the pursuit of continental objectives.
Basically, we can all agree that because of the various interests of the various African member states, that is why we're not able to. Now, let's go to ASAN, right? We'll go into the next narrative. If you look at the theme of the AU summit, it's focused on reparation. Reparation is a difficult concept to talk about. But let's go to the diaspora, right? If you look at the summit, right, the diaspora did not take any active role, right? We know that the African Americans are seriously fighting on reparations, right? They've been doing that. So if there is anything that has to do with reparation, the best people to speak about that has to start with the African Americans, right? So let's look at the diaspora. Now, the diaspora has been considered, or there's a resolution that has been passed to make the diaspora the sixth region of the African Union Commission, right? Now, there's a disagreement as to what they wanted those people in the diaspora to do. I've had a show on that. According to some of the experts who went to the CEDAW, right, the conference that happened first in Senegal, then went to Brazil, then they came to Addis Ababa, right? I spoke to Molefe Kenti, and he said the original intent of the diaspora was to organize the diaspora as one group of people, right? One group, one continental group, which includes Africans who are descendants of slaves and Africans who are descendants of voluntary immigrants. Because when we talk about the diaspora, we mean two different groups of people. The older diaspora, who are descendants of slaves, and the new diaspora, who are descendants of voluntary immigrants. So the original intent was to organize all of them together, right? But along the line, it changed. Various African countries are organizing their own diaspora. So Ghana has its own diaspora. Kenya has its own diaspora. Cote d'Ivoire has its own diaspora. Okay, let's agree that is fine, right? But what about the descendants of the slaves? How do you expect them to organize themselves? So this has been a challenge, right? And they said they wanted to establish what they call what interim management committee, right? An interim committee. So we suggested that if you want to start with an interim diaspora committee, focus on the US, because the US is where majority of the diaspora live. So they will be able to organize from here. And if they are able to set themselves here, then they'll move to Brazil. Then from Brazil, they'll move to the other areas. We've not been able to do that, right? I don't know, it is a shortcoming of the African Union that it seems like it's too much work for them. So they don't want to do that. But let's come to the issue of the funding, right? The African Union can easily raise all the money it needs to do its programs just by focusing only on the diaspora, right? Look at the Africans who live on the diaspora, who send remittances. Look at African Americans who are in the US Congress, right? Who have political will, congressional, who can able to. Why are we not looking into the diaspora and how to get the diaspora involved in African Union activities rather than relying on the UN, the EU, ISAN? Why are we not taking advantage of the diaspora? Since we've declared the diaspora.
Well, I think this issue, the issue of the diaspora, the African diaspora, um, is quite really interesting and requires, I think, its own session, you know, to go in depth about all these interesting themes that are related to it. Let me give it a try. So first, when we are talking about the sixth region, the sixth African region, it sounds really nice and beautiful politically and as a concept. However, I think I'm pragmatic and realistic at the same time. When it comes to actual actions, implementations, what do we have to offer? Or what does the African Union has to offer, and what is the African Union in a position to expect from the diaspora, or even to incentivize, to motivate the diaspora to get interested in what is going on the continent? We spoke about some of the issues that could be solved with only a strong political will, which we are not doing, like the African integration. But it's a nightmare to travel from one country of Africa to the other, you know. So if you are bringing in the diaspora, are you going to devise a specific policy for them so that if somebody coming from Brazil can travel easily to all African countries without the need of a visa? But if me in Cote d'Ivoire, I need to go to South Africa, it's a nightmare. I want to go to Congo, it's impossible. I want to go to Algeria, to Morocco, it's not possible. So I think there is a saying in we are Africans that if you want somebody to come and sleep over your place, you know, you need to clean your house first. So that's the issue. What are we putting in place so that if we want to integrate the diaspora, is made easy and smooth? Let at least have this free movement of people, the African Union passport, so that you can travel everywhere, wherever you want to go. And then on this basis, we go to the diaspora to say that, oh, look, this is the wonderful thing that we have been able to achieve on our continent, our common, you know, our motherland. Please come wherever you want to go. You'll be free to go. But we don't offer anything. We are not offering anything. We are not offering like okay, if a company is competing for a bid on the African continent and is a company funded by some descent of the African continent, then you might be in a favorable position. You might be favored because you are a son of Africa. We need more. We need to attract more investors from the African diaspora. There's no such policies. So I commend the initiative of Ghana and Benin, their policies to attract more people from the diaspora. And I think what has been like a landmark on this continent or in most of our history is that a country starts something, the other country follows suit, and from step by step, many other countries copy the same thing. So now you see that countries like Rwanda, Ghana, Benin, some others want to implement the free movement of people on their own, like opening the borders to all Africans who can travel there without the need for a visa. We need to push for some of these policies before we call in the CIS region or the diaspora. So
All
this
right.
also leads to another, yeah.
Prof, let me come to you on the topic of reparation, right? We'll delve into the other issues in terms of the modalities and guidelines for setting a diaspora. Can the African Union talk about reparation without getting the diaspora, the old diaspora involved? Is it
In my
possible?
view, that they cannot, and if they do so, then it is highly unlikely that they will succeed in that endeavor. And they need to borrow from our African leaders who went before in terms of fighting for the dignity of the African person, whether on the continent or in the diaspora. The Africans on the continent found unity in this concept of Pan-Africanism in terms of having been jointly colonized by the Western world. The Africans in the diaspora found unity in Pan-Africanism on the basis of their having been enslaved by the Western world. The leaderships from both continents came together to fight for their common cause on the basis of their having been jointly exploited by the Western world. And if the African Union, if the African leaders are going to pursue this idea of reparations without involving the old diaspora out here, they will be doing themselves a great disservice, because the people of the old diaspora actually contributed immensely to the fight for independence on the African continent. People like W.E.B. Du Bois, people like Marcus Garvey, people like Ralph Bunche. There are many individuals who actually organized congresses to discuss strategies for fighting for the dignity of the African person, for the independence of the African countries, and for the emancipation of the people of African origin in the so-called this new world. And so any efforts at extracting reparations from colonialism, from exploitation, from slavery, and so on, has to be a joint effort in the manner in which these leaders actually jointly fought for the dignity of the African person long before the coming of independence. It is remarkable that somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois ended up emigrating to Ghana, and that is where he lived and died after Ghana became independent. It is remarkable that someone like Ralph Bunche has a road named after him in Nairobi. It is a recognition of their contribution to the struggle for the political independence of these countries. And if African leaders are going to achieve anything on the front of reparations, there is no way they can proceed without involving the old diaspora out here.
Yeah, let me follow it up, right? If you look at the CIS region, right, when it was created, they set up what we call modalities and guidelines, right? For the modalities and guidelines should be set up by an interim committee, right? So the interim committee should be set up. The African Union has not set up that interim committee, but it has left the interim committee to be set up by the diaspora. And I find it very, very ironic that you have come out with something, put in place guidelines and modalities. Because, okay, you have to be able to think that, okay, when we are talking about a diaspora, it's a huge place. Which of these areas will be easy to organize, right? Because where we have most of the Africans, people of African descent, is the United States and Brazil. And United States is where the power is and where the finance is. So why don't you focus through the African Union ambassador to the United States, right? Why don't you allow them to engage with Black congressional caucus people in terms of political leadership to see how best we can start the organization from the United States? If it becomes very, very successful, then you move to probably to Brazil. And from Brazil, you move. But when you think about it, it seems like it's too much work. So they don't want to get themselves involved in that. They say, okay, we have done what we were supposed to do by making the sixth region, the diaspora, the sixth region. It's up to them for them to organize themselves. And that has been the problem. That is why all the countries have decided to say, okay, let's try to organize our own diaspora. Let's try to organize our own diaspora without taking into consideration what the older diaspora which has been there.
Exactly. And that speaks to the seriousness of the African Union in terms of the activities it wants to get involved in or it wants to pursue. How do you generate that and then leave it out there like that? It doesn't speak very well of the organization because there is need then to really lay down the structures that are needed in order to pursue the objective. And the fact that they have left it at that point tells us that they are not very serious about pursuing particular activities, pursuing particular agendas that are for the benefit of the continent, for the benefit of the African people. Because they should be the ones on the forefront in terms of organizing this, in terms of structuring it. And so the degeneration into then each country now seeking to organize their own diaspora speaks to the idea that then the interest becomes less continental, you see, and more national, which then fractures the whole purpose because then you cannot have the unity of purpose to be able to extract what you are calling reparations if you are going to approach it from a national level instead of from a continental and pan-continental level in terms of the diaspora and the continental people in Africa. And so unfortunately, it tells us that then the African Union may not be as serious as it ought to be in terms of pursuing agendas that are relevant to the African cause.
Right. Let's go to Isan about the issue of funding, whereby if we are able to organize the diaspora very well, right? Even if we are able to organize it on a national level, right? And it's well structured, the African Union will be able, because look at the remittances that go to the African continent. If they are able to engage the diaspora, that with any kind of transaction that is sent to the African continent, right? The African Union is going to have probably like a 0.003% of tax on that transaction. They should be able to raise a lot of money so as to not rely on the UN and the EU, because this has been the bane, because the UN and the EU are the one funding you. They tend to dictate the agenda that you have to pursue. So what is it that we are so afraid to do in terms of engaging the diaspora? Because the diaspora is the future of the African continent. We have to come to that. That is what the Chinese did. That is what the Japanese did. They were able to rely on Chinese overseas. They were able to rely on Japanese overseas. But the African Union has not been able to find a way on a continental level to make use of the diaspora. The various national countries have been able to tap into that. A friend was telling me that people on the African continent see, the African leaders see those in the diaspora as an ATM machine. They just come and raise money, and when they raise money, they are gone. But if we are able to structure the diaspora very well, either on the national level, on the continental level, we should be able to raise a lot of money in terms of remittances that will go towards the African Union. Ethan, what is your take on that? I should hope that you are aware of the Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast of Cote d'Ivoire diaspora in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this is exactly the way to go. But at the same time, talking about the African diaspora is also something that we need to give it a lot of thought. You cited two categories, like the descendant of slaves and then of the migrants. But at the same time, even if you take these two as categories, but there are so many differences. Like if you take those in the United States and Brazil and in Europe and in the Arabic world and everywhere, do we all have this common sense that we need to, unite with Africa? Not so much, not everyone, not, I would say everybody, but at least there have been some leaders and some organizations and institutions that have been instrumental over the years, over, I would say, the decades in undertaking one action or the other. I think one thing like that the African Union should do is to have is African diaspora policy with maybe beyond these conferences that have been organized in Dakar, Brazil, Ethiopia, to have a joint or a sub entity that is devoted or dedicated specifically to the diaspora issues and matters. That's look into it, take the issues, analyze it, organize meetings, conferences, attract investors from the diaspora to the African continent and vice versa, organize cultural exchanges, suggest policies in favor of a diaspora, in favor of the integration of a diaspora. I think if we have this sub-entity, it will help to solve a lot of problems. And I really appreciated the fact that during the recent General Assembly of the African Union, the Prime Minister of Barbados was invited, and I listened carefully to her statement, and I was really happy. I will give you an excerpt of it. She said, "If we leave Addis Ababa with a commitment that the world is not going to be safe without a prosperous and a stable Africa, then we understand what is the moral imperative we must undertake in each of our countries to secure that unity of purpose, to secure ultimately the saving of people and the planet." Yeah, she talked also about climate change and the issues. Some of the countries in which these diaspora people are, the issues we are facing, like Barbados, with climate change and all these issues. I remember that a few years ago, about 2010 or 2012, when there was the earthquake in Haiti, a former African president suggested that people from Haiti should be, removed and come to Africa. But yes, you said it, but where is the policy? Where are the infrastructure? Where is the space? How are you going to implement it? So it's easily said than done. We need to move beyond rhetorics. We need to move beyond, interesting, even visions, but we need to take actions, and action has to start with dialogue, with knowing each other better. Let me give you this example. I participated in this initiative by President Obama, the Young African Leadership Initiative, where I found myself in the United States, and for the first time in my life, meeting other African leaders from other countries, but it was not on the African continent, it was in the United States, where I met Africa, where I met people. I made friends from Uganda, from Kenya, from South Africa, from Ethiopia, from Cameroon, everywhere across the continent. Why is not the African Union organizing such things so that the African youth can come together to know each other better? Why are we not doing these things with the diaspora, purposefully, so that it's like an annual or biannual meeting or rendezvous, whereby we know that each year in August, okay, it's the African Union event or a cultural event. So we need to go to Brazil, or we need to come to Cote d'Ivoire or Ethiopia for some special events, so that we can know each other better. Youth summits, with its diaspora and the African youth. All are these things that could be, ideas that can be implemented by a sub-entity of the African Union that cater for the needs of a CIS, or for the integration of a CIS, I would say, region. And if others, people in the diaspora who are reluctant, see that there is something going on, they will join the move. That's why I still commend what Benin and Ghana are doing. Many other countries should follow suit, and then the African Union as an entity should have a proper policy for this integration. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Let me come to you, Prof. Right. So the African Union, we know they have an office which is known as CIDO, the department that deals with the diaspora issues, right? And the diaspora has an observation status. How to organize the diaspora. That's a problem the African Union has, because that sounds like a huge problem for them, right? And I think that is what they are struggling and say, okay, you know what? We've set it up, we've put in the modality and guidelines. It's up to you for you to do it. But for them, in their mind, when they are talking about a diaspora, for ordinary people on the African continent, when they talk about a diaspora, they are talking about the new diaspora, right? Which are the descendants of the voluntary immigrants. But the power that we have, the power that diaspora have, the rest with the old diaspora, not the new diaspora. The new diaspora, they come and work and they are going back. But the old diaspora, they are well organized. The Congressional Black Caucus, those organized, represented by Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson and all those people, they have power to influence policy, like you stated. They have influenced policy on the African continent over the years. So if we are not able to engage this particular aspect of diaspora, whatever we are doing is going to take us decades and decades and decades. Because they have the political power, they have the economic power. So if you have the economic power, you have the political power. I don't know whether it is fear of what happened in Liberia and what happened in Sierra Leone, which is re-echoing itself, that if you give these people more political power and economic power, they are going to take over the continent. That will be something probably might be thinking about. But if we have to move forward as the continent, we have to engage. Myself and yourself, we belong to the new diaspora. We have our way of saying things, which may be different from the old diaspora, right? But the African Union has not even been able to engage the new diaspora, me and you. They've not been able. If you look at some of the programs that they hold at Addis Ababa and things like that, it is they speaking among themselves, right? Without even engaging the new diaspora, which are in the West. Then to talk of engaging the old diaspora that have a completely different mindset from the new diaspora. So I think this is the biggest challenge the African Union is. But it's time that they take the bull by the horn and say, hey, we have to do this because this is the future of the continent.
Yeah, but you see, yes, that is correct. That is where, for example, if they are going to be serious about engaging the diaspora, whether new or old, and my view is that they should engage both, then why, if they have declared the diaspora the 6th region, why shouldn't we be able to elect our own to represent the interests of the diaspora at the headquarters in Addis Ababa? Why shouldn't that office that deals with the diaspora, why should it not have some representatives, do you see, from the diaspora? Perhaps elected for a period of time and then re-elections take place, you see. That is the only way you are going to engage, to inject some sense of urgency in these matters at the African Union itself. But you create that office and then you staff it with people from the continent and you say you are dealing with the diaspora. You are not, do you see? Because you are disengaged. Let us, if we have declared this as the 6th region of the continent, then let us have that region have representation, effective representation. Let us identify where the greatest diaspora is, and let us decide how many representatives from this region, from that region, and then they are representing the interests of the diaspora in engaging then with the African Union at the continental level. And that is the only way we are going to move forward in terms of this kind of engagement for purposes of generating actually benefits for all of us. Otherwise, it just seems like it is much talk and nothing follows the talk. It is just a question of tokenism. When we say we have set up an office to deal with the diaspora, but the diaspora is not even represented. So we are not doing much. And that is the problem with that approach. And it is one that will not lead to any effective outcomes of the process of this kind of engagement.
All right, thank you very much. Let me come to Esan, right? If you look at the African Union chairmanship race, right, they preserved the deputy AU Commission chairperson to a woman to have gender balance, right? Isn't it time that probably they have to consider that, okay, we have to bring in people from the diaspora. So let's make the general secretary of the African Union somebody from the diaspora. Isn't it time for them to start thinking in that direction? Let's integrate all of them. Let's try to have a position like Prof is saying, let's give them a representation on the African Union Commission so that they will also bring their expertise, their knowledge. They'll be able to organize the diaspora to be part of a greater African Union Commission. If we have been able to do this for gender equality in terms of making the deputy AU commissioner a woman, isn't it time that we should also start thinking in terms of bringing a representation onto the African Union Commission, just like like Prof said? Wouldn't you share with that thought?
Well, absolutely. I think this is a wonderful suggestion that should be part of a specific, targeted, and I would say an objective diaspora policy for the African Union. Because if there is, yes, as part of the structure of the African Union, a representative for diaspora, be a deputy chairperson or the head of one entity or one institution. And this is properly communicated and through lobbying and outreach activities in the diaspora in the United States, in Brazil, and other countries. And people know about it. Like recently, Mr. Melvin Foote told me that he was in Canada participating in an Afro leadership summit that was put together. Yeah. So as part of these annual conferences, if there is a place that has a lot of interest for the diaspora within the African Union, I think it will create a kind of incentive for the people of diaspora to organize more and to be willing to engage more. So definitely, I second these suggestions, and I think this is something that we need to put forward as the African Union so that we integrate more the diaspora beyond the talks, beyond the words. We can't hear you, Dr.
If you look at the new AU Commission chairperson, he is talking about resolving the conflict on the African continent, which is very, very important, right? And in all these things that we are doing in terms of resolving the conflict, we've not talked about the diaspora in terms of what role the diaspora could do to help resolve some of the conflict. If you look at the silencing the gangs, right, they're talking about going to the root causes of the internal and external causes of conflict on the African continent. In all these things, we don't talk about the diaspora. We talk about what is happening. Now let's look at the Congo crisis. What is happening in the Congo, right? We're trying to find a solution to the problem. We're talking about the root causes of the problem, right? The root causes of the problem, we are engaging AAC. We are also engaging SADC, right? These are two blocks with countries that have vested interest in what happens in DR Congo. We know that Angola is the one leading the new diplomatic initiative, right? Angola has troops in DR Congo. South Africa, which is leading SADC, has interest in DR Congo. Uganda has its army in DR Congo. Burundi has army in DR Congo. So if we are trying to look at the root causes of these problems, how do we look at those surrounding countries who have vested interests in DR Congo? How do you resolve the root cause of these problems when those that you are engaging to do the diplomatic maneuvering are vested in in what is happening in the Congo?
Well, it is a very complex question because of the complexity of the interests involved in the Congo. And for me, that speaks to the capacity of the African Union security architecture. If we have political leaders, neighboring countries that have interests in an ongoing conflict, whose interests are actually fuel the conflict, what are we going to do about it? Do you see? That is a huge question for the African Union security architecture. I don't know what they are up to, but it is one of the things that make such conflicts very complex and very problematic to resolve because of this interest of other actors in the system. But for me, the African Union can actually learn from how the Intergovernmental Authority on Development in Eastern Africa was able to intervene in the conflict between the North and the South in the Sudan that actually led to the resolution of that conflict to the satisfaction of the Southern Sudanese people. By the time the IGAD was coming into that conflict in 1994, there had been more than 70 agreements between the combatants that were never effectively implemented, that never actually dealt with the root causes of the conflict. And that is how come the IGAD, when they came in, and they came mainly because they were affected by the conflict as well, by the spillover of refugees, the disruption of security on the borders, and so on. So they had a stake in resolving that conflict. And they really delineated the root causes of the conflict and laid it out in no uncertain terms. And that formed the basis of negotiations that eventually led to the signing of a comprehensive peace agreement in Nairobi in 2005. So it can be done if countries, if the African Union, if the institution called the Security Architect of the Union can actually be single-mindedly focused on the need to dig out the root cause of the problem and outline the main resolutions to that conflict. It can be done as it has been done before. But that is the challenge, do you see? So if Rwanda has interests in the DRC, if Uganda has interests in the DRC, if Angola has interests in the DRC, and if the ongoing conflict is beneficial to their interests, how are we as a union then going to deal with the process of resolving that conflict?
What do you also have to say in terms of those countries in the region, their own interest, critical mineral resources interest in DR Congo, and how do we address the situation, right, with these people having their own interest? Because we can have a Pan-Africanist approach to resolving it, but it seems like we are looking at the various countries that are over there have their own critical mineral resource interest, and that is why the problem is not being resolved. What is your take on that?
Should number one, I don't know if this has ever been discussed. I mean, it has been discussed before, but I think no resolutions were reached, especially with regard to establishing an African continental security force. That would be the best way of dealing with such conflicts. If we had a continental security force contributed to by the different members of the African Union, stationed in a particular place. And then we say, oh, if the institutions focused on peace, whatever resolution, conflict resolution, could come up with a resolution about the need to establish, even if it's an ad hoc one, do you see, a force with the requisite numbers, with the requisite capability to move into a conflict region like the Congo and actually get it stopped. I think that might be the best way to go about it. Because there is this thing that I have come to know research on as uh, disaster capitalism. Disaster capitalism is what is going on in the Congo. So we say the Eastern Congo has been in conflict for decades, but economic activities are going on. Minerals are being extracted. Minerals are being shipped out. Airstrips are busy. Airplanes are flying in and out, carrying coltan, carrying gold, carrying all manner of minerals that are critical to the modern IT industry. And so it is disaster capitalism that is going on. And if it is going to be seriously resolved, we need very serious resolutions about how to move forward, including creating a force that should be sent in to end that conflict once and for all.
Let's go to Eastern. What are your expectations of the new AU Commission chairperson? He brought issues of resolving conflicts on the African continent. Do you think you'll be able to do such a thing in terms of what is happening in DR Congo, what is happening in Darfur, what is happening in Sudan, what is happening in Somalia? He has his hands full. Then you are talking about the breakaway of the three countries in the Sahel. That's a lot. What are your expectations?
Well, thank you. Please let me comment quickly on the Congo issue before I talk about the expectations, though all of them are related.
Sure.
First of all, I do not see the fact that all these countries have an interest in the DRC has a real impediment to, searching or, to the research of a peace agreement or a sustainable peace. It's true we are talking about the African Union, but at the same time, maybe our African leaders within our countries need to be more, I would say, uh, to have visions for their countries. I will not go into details, but I think if this issue has gone on for years, for decades, it means that something needs to happen internally to the DRC before even external actors can help. Um, going back to the expectations for the new African Union chairperson, uh, and this goes back to the first question you asked about the move from the OAU to the AU. I do not see a lot of change in the type of issues that the OAU were facing to the issues we are facing now, which represent the challenges that the African Union chairperson need to take as a priority, because there were conflict, there were inter-country conflict at the time, internal conflict to countries, which we still have now, and at the time the population of Africa was less. Now we have double or triple the populations of Africa. So there is more demographic pressure and more issues, more conflicts. Before we did not have a violent extremist threat. Now we have terrorism on the continent of Africa, with Boko Haram in Nigeria, in Chad, Cameroon, and Daesh and Al Qaeda in the Sahel regions. We used to have unconstitutional change of power. We thought that this was all history, but unfortunately, you are in West Africa, and most of our neighbors in West Africa are led by military regimes. So these are all issues that our continental entity needs to take as a priority and try to solve. But at the same time, I wonder if the entity has enough, I think, leverage, enough power to have effect on all of these issues. I think one thing that maybe this President Mahmoud Ali can do and will achieve is to try to build, stronger institutions with the African Union. positioning the African Union is institutions like the Peace and Security Council and all the economic integrations entities, positioning them as strong entities on the African continent that can cater to the needs of the African people everywhere. This is first thing that maybe it could achieve. Second thing, there was this policy of the ECOWAS in West Africa, the ECOWAS of the people. Can we do an African Union of the people so that the ordinary people know about the African Union? Because I can tell you, I bet that maybe my mother does not know anything about the African Union. What are the projects? What are the activities? What are the impact of the policies and policies and decisions of African Union on our life in, everywhere across Africa? Let the African Union be present in the life of Africans. Let us identify with the African Union. If it succeeds, I think it will be really, really good. The third thing, and I will stop here, is that it should try to leverage, a kind of unity so that the Africa has a common voice in some of the issues across the world. Like we took the example of the crisis in Ukraine, whereby on the one hand, Russia sought to have the support of some African countries on their side. The Western world also tried to have the support of some African countries on their side, to the extent that there is no African agency. Where is our voice? Where is our agency as Africans, as an entity, as the oldest continent, as we call us? Where is our voice? What is our position? Should we always be divided between the world powers? Can't we also be a world power? I think these are some of the issues that it needs to look into before even trying to tackle some of these, I would say, specific issues, which are also priorities. But if we do not have a strong institution, if we do not have a strong voice, if his leadership is not perceived as, I would say, a leadership in favor of Africa, but if a leadership influenced by any other foreign interest, I will say that it will be doomed to fail. Over to you.
Right. All right. Thank you very much. Let's come to your prof. Right? You're going to get a last closing remark. If you were advising Yusuf, right, we identify financing to be one of the biggest problems that leads to a lot of interventions, interference, then we're looking also as a conflict, right? If you were advising him and you are trying to navigate between the diaspora, intervention, and conflict, what would we be saying to him in terms of your closing remarks?
Well, yeah, in terms of resources, my advice would be that as much as possible, raise resources from the continent for purposes of running the affairs of the organization. If he has to look elsewhere, perhaps it might be slightly better to look at organizations like the UN rather than individual powers like the US, like China, like France, because once those are going to be funding your programs or giving you resources, it follows that they will make particular demands on you, and you will never remain neutral. You will never remain independent in terms of fashioning your own agenda for the organization that you lead. So that is one. Number two, I would advise him. So in addition to what my co-panelist has mentioned, which very effectively, I will advise him to also broach the subject that we have discussed previously about raising revenue from the African diaspora, especially with regard to these remittances. Governments generate a lot of revenue for themselves from the remittances that come out here among diasporic Africans. And if just a small percentage then is given to the African Union, they will raise enough money to run their efforts. Number three, I would advise him about the resolution of especially protracted conflicts like those of the DRC. Can we be a little bit more radical in terms of how we approach these issues, rather than just the normal way of mediating and this and that, which is never effective or rarely effective. So can we take a much more radical approach to resolving conflict on the continent? And finally, I would advise him, and I'm sure I think this one he knows very well, to run the organization in a manner that focuses on continental objectives, continental interests, rather than regional ones. And that would make the organization much more effective and have a more positive image than it has had hitherto, especially with regard to how it has approached conflicts around the continent.
Right. Thank you very much. Time is fast spent, right? So on this note, we come to the end of another edition of the Sankofa African webinar, a program which is supposed to bring experts from the African continent and the diaspora to discuss issues affecting the African continent. Today, we're lucky to have Isan from Cote d'Ivoire, and we're able to have Dr. Wanjala and Sango also all the way from Tennessee. So we'll say a thank you to two of our panelists. Those panelists were not able to join us because of the time conflict that we had. We hope to get them another time. So I will continue. We're looking forward to discussing the new African Union chairperson and President Trump and his policies. So we're looking at U.S.-African relations and what holds forward, what holds going forward. So on this note, we say thank you for Sankofa and hope to see you next weekend. Right, enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.